This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
We're very, very pleased to have our Swedish colleague, Nehlin from the University of Stockholm, who's going to be speaking tonight about the Swedish Save the Children Fund and its activities during the Second World War.
That's right. Yes. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as you said, I work at the Department of History at Stockholm University, but I received my PhD at the Department of Child Studies at Linköping University, which is an interdisciplinary department. And I have been teaching a lot since I received my PhD, but in 2013 I did, together with 3 other colleagues, managed to obtain funding from the Swedish Research Council for a project which will be running for 3 years, and it's actually an extension of my thesis, and it's called New Homes in Sweden, and deals with the transportation of 70,000 children from Finland to Sweden during World War II. I will touch. Sorry.
A bit of a long walk around the Senate.
Hi.
Hello. Sorry.
I'm fine, thanks. Nice to see you.
Sorry. Recommence.
It's okay. No problem. Okay. I'll just start from the top, I think. I was just telling everyone that I work at the Department of History at Stockholm University, and I'm going to talk about Save the Children Fund's expansion during World War II. Okay. That children should be exempted from war and political conflicts, regardless of nationality, religious affiliation, is something that by most countries, governments and non-governmental organizations is considered self-evident. The number of nations that ratified the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child in 1989 is a clear sign of this. However, looking back historically, we can see that this has been, in many cases, a difficult task to fulfill. During the aftermath of the 2 world wars, when nationalistic currents and political conflicts in Europe were strong, politics appears to have played an important part in decisions on how relief activities for children were performed. In the shaping of Swedish international relief activities directed towards children during and after World War II, this became increasingly visible. To not let nationality, politics, religion or background influence how, where and towards which children relief was directed was hampered by the politics of neutrality that was enforced by the Swedish government during this time. In Sweden, during the 20th century, state intervention in social matters has been emphasized. Having said this, philanthropic organizations such as Save the Children Fund have played an important role in bringing attention to and dealing with such issues.
Sorry, am I in the wrong place?
Save the Children.
No. Thank you, sorry about that.
The Swedish Save the Children Fund have in particular had a large impact in shaping politics and policies in questions concerning children's welfare in Sweden. To create space for its activities, the Swedish Save the Children Fund have had to negotiate not only with other organizations, but also with Swedish authorities, and I have in my thesis called this the struggle of organizational space. This struggle took place during a time when quite dramatic national and international changes occurred, which also forced the organization to have a feel for political currents of its time. And in Sweden this was, during the war years, the politics of neutrality. The Swedish Save the Children Fund was successful in creating its space. Not only did it grow in numbers, it gained a position as an informal advisor to the Swedish government on where and to whom relief, mainly for children, but also sometimes for adults, was going to be provided. The close cooperation with the Swedish government enabled the Swedish Save the Children Fund to expand enormously, and as pointed out, to obtain an important and influential position. However, this came at a cost. The Swedish Save the Children Fund was a member of the International Save the Children Fund, which required that it took part in international relief activities, a requirement that became complicated to take into account at the same time as working alongside the Swedish government's non-intervention policies on the international arena during World War II. Before going into how the Swedish organization performed relief work towards this background, I will give you a brief account of how the organization first was established in Sweden, and also what the political situation was like during the period of time which my study covers, which is 1938 to 1956. So let's start out in 1920, when the organization was first established in Sweden. The establishment of Save the Children Fund in Sweden took place only a couple of months after the original branch was established here in Great Britain in 1919. This was not a coincidence. The two sisters, Eglantine Jebb and Dorothy Buxton, as I'm sure you know, were the founders of Save the Children Fund here, had during World War I translated international press, which was published in the Cambridge magazine, this to try and give a fair picture of the development of the war. A consequence of this work were that they were very well aware of what the situation in different countries was like. At this time, after World War I, people in parts of Sweden, especially the north, did suffer from extreme poverty. But Sweden had been spared from the war, and in comparison to other countries, the situation was of course much better. Eglantine Jebb and Dorothy Buxton were aware of this, and Sweden was one of the first countries they approached to gain support for their newly established organization. However, prior to this, there were a lot of contact between Swedish and British intellectuals and politicians. Supporters of the Fight-to-Famine Council actively tried to establish international cooperation to put pressure on the British government to abolish the blockade after World War I. And one country they reached out to gain support to for this was Sweden. For instance, did Charles Roden Buxton, also a member of the Independent Labour Party, have a fairly regular contact with the Swedish Prime Minister at the time, Hjalmar Branting, whose support for the Swedish Save the Children Fund would become important for the organization's establishment. The two professors of economics, Maynard Keynes and the Swedish Gustav Cassel, also had regular contact, and in letters to Gustav Cassel, Maynard Keynes discussed the blockade and the, what he thought, very harsh peace settlement with Germany. Dorothy Buxton and Eglantine Jebb made contact with, amongst others, the author, journalist and social democrat Anna-Lena Elgström, who was going to be one of the founders of the Swedish branch of Save the Children Fund. She visited Britain on several occasions to see how the British organization planned and performed their campaigns and activities. One person, Dorothy Buxton and Eglantine Jebb, also made contact with, who perhaps is a bit more known outside of Sweden, was the author and feminist and educator Ellen Key. Ellen Key had a large impact on issues concerning the welfare of children in Sweden at the time, and gaining her support would definitely have been an advantage for the Save the Children Fund's establishment in Sweden. Ellen Key declared that the 20th century was going to be the century of the child, and in year 1900 she published her book, which had that exact title, The Century of the Child. This book has been translated to several different languages and has been reprinted many times. Ellen Key was a controversial person, not afraid to speak her mind. She claimed that schools enslaved children and prevented their creativity. She also stated that children should be allowed to choose their parents. This was, of course, provocative statements. She too gave the Swedish Save the Children Fund her support, but quickly withdrew and became one of the Swedish organization's critics. The Fight-to-Famine Council was not very successful in Sweden. Even if some support was given, no branch of the organization was established. Save the Children Fund had a far greater success, and as pointed out, only a couple of months after the British organization was established, a branch was up and running in Sweden. One reason for the quick establishment was that the British organisation sent an envoy, Marian Chadwick, to help setting up the Swedish branch. In Sweden, the founders were mainly women from the intellectual elite and the Swedish upper class. Their names and reputations gave the organisation credibility, which of course was important. The first chairwoman, Anna Lindhagen, was also a feminist, suffragette, politically active in the Swedish Social Democrats, and had previously been active in the peace movement. The Swedish Save the Children Fund attracted a lot of attention from prominent Swedes, but critique was also forwarded early on. And as I mentioned, Ellen Key was one of the critiques. In November 1920, Dorothy Buxton visited Sweden, and at a gathering for the Swedish Save the Children Fund's board and other members, she and Ellen Key were the main speakers. And this is a press cutting from one of Sweden's largest newspapers. And the fact that Ellen Key participated in this gathering would have brought a lot of attention to that event. And the headline says, "Acts of love needs to be evaluated." And this according to Ellen Key. Dorothy Buxton complimented the Swedish branch for how it cared for the children's physical well-being, but she also forwarded a very low-key criticism that the children's souls also needed attention. The next speaker was Ellen Key. She was not a low-key person. She accused the members of the Swedish organization for being so busy patting each other's backs for the relief work they had performed, instead of being concerned about what more they could do. She also accused them of not caring for the children's souls, which she thought was appalling. Critique has surfaced on several occasions throughout the Swedish organization's history. It has been accused of having too high expenditures, of having made charity into an industry, and for spending money on luxury rather than needy children. Whatever the critique, the Swedish organization were active for a few years in the early 20s in giving relief to children. The bulk of that relief was directed to Germany and Austria, but to a smaller extent to Russia as well. In 1924, the Swedish public had lost interest in supporting the organization, and it withdrew from international relief altogether due to a lack of funding. Anna-Lena Elström strongly protested against this decision, since she firmly believed that it was important for the organization to be a part of what she called the international chain of relief. During the interwar years, the organization provided relief within Sweden and led a reclusive existence. However, at the outbreak of World War II, this changed, and during the war years, the organization expanded rapidly. In 1937, the organization had 260 members. In 1947, this had increased to 47,000 members. It did not only expand in number of members, it expanded geographically as well. In 1939, there were 4 local branches, which by 1946 had increased to 150, covering most parts of Sweden. As I said before, the organization's expansion took place during a time when dramatic changes took place. Even if Sweden did not directly participate in the war, it was still affected, and after the decision to enforce a politics of neutrality was taken, a juggling, which was going to remain throughout the war, started, on how this was going to be upheld and what the boundaries were, and also what consequences it would have after the war. I will give you a brief account of the political situation in Sweden to contextualize the Swedish organization's development. During the winter of 1939 to 1940, the Soviet Union attacked a fairly unprepared Finland. The so-called Winter War broke out. The American war correspondent Martha Gellhorn covered this for the American magazine Collier's Weekly. She visited both Sweden and Finland, and in an article she wrote, "Swedish hearts are with the Finns, but they trade with the Germans." I think this summarizes the situation in Sweden quite well. The outbreak of the Winter War caused a brutal awakening for Sweden. The idea of possibly having the Soviet Union as next-door neighbor was not an appealing thought. This picture is taken after one of the bombings of Helsinki. However, a politics of neutrality was stipulated by the Swedish government at the outbreak of the war, and this meant, in brief, that Sweden did not participate in any of the armed conflicts that were taking place, nor did Sweden side with any of the warfaring countries. This included Finland. Requests from Finland to get military support was declined, but huge efforts to provide relief for Finland were made and involved the general public, school children, churches, government, members of the business community, NGOs, etc. Most Swedes appear to have been involved in gathering relief for and give Finland support in some way. An armed voluntary corps were set up and sent to Finland to support the Finnish army, but Swedish government was very careful in not being connected to this venture because of the neutrality. Having said this, Swedish neutrality was, at least in some cases, a negotiable condition. For instance, did the Swedish government from 1940 and 3 years onward allow approximately 2 million German soldiers and 100,000 German railway carriages with military equipment to pass through the country. The decision to allow this was not uncomplicated for the Swedish government, and it led to a crisis within Swedish domestic politics. The core of this problem appears to have been on how to calculate risks, more than keeping up with the stipulated politics of neutrality throughout the war. Whether Germany actually were planning to invade Sweden has been debated among scholars, but whatever the case, as pointed out, concessions were made towards Germany. Apart from a fear of being invaded by Germany unless concessions were made, another important reason for Sweden to keep good relations with Germany was that it was advantageous for Swedish business and industry. The trade with Germany was important for Sweden, but also for Germany. The import of Swedish steel and iron was important for the German war industry. This trade caused the Allies to forward sharp critique to the Swedish government towards the end of the war. In 1944, the American President Franklin Roosevelt urged Winston Churchill to put maximum pressure on Swedish government to cut all business dealings with Germany. It was considered unacceptable that Sweden nourished the German war industry while Allied soldiers died on the battlefield. Within Sweden, a concern of what consequences the politics of neutrality was going to have for the country after the war started to surface towards the end of the war. Two prominent Swedes, Alva Myrdal, feminist and social democrat, and later UN delegate, who had an enormous influence in the shaping of Swedish welfare policies, and Folke Bernadotte, vice chairman of the Swedish Red Cross and member of the royal family, did during the last part of the war both raise the issue of what Sweden's position on the international arena was going to have after the war. Folke Bernadotte foresaw that the politics of neutrality could damage Sweden's reputation on the international arena. According to him, one way to counteract this was to increase Swedish international relief work. Alva Myrdal agreed with this, and also she emphasized that Sweden could not remain isolated. The country had to contribute to create lasting peace in the world. Early in 1944, the Swedish government decided to establish a committee which was going to coordinate all Swedish relief work abroad. A substantial amount of money, approximately £12 million, was allocated for the task. This decision by the Swedish government triggered a turf war between Swedish NGOs, a turf war that also the government committee that was set up to distribute the money and deal with this task participated in. Alva Myrdal was appointed to be head of the government committee, but NGO representatives as Folke Bernadotte and Margit Levinson, who had by then replaced Anna Lindhagen as chairwoman of the Swedish Save the Children Fund, had seats on the committee. Within this government committee, intense and heated debates took place between Alva Myrdal and Folke Bernadotte. The core of the conflict was on who was going to represent Sweden internationally. Folke Bernadotte thought that this was a task for the Swedish Red Cross, since the organization was a part of an international organization, and if the Swedish government represented Sweden on the international arena, the neutrality could be put into question. Alva Myrdal strongly disagreed and questioned the Swedish Red Cross credibility and forwarded opinions that the organization was not democratic and did not represent Swedish civil society. The chairwoman of the Swedish Save the Children Fund, Margit Levinson, sided with Alva Myrdal and emphasized that it was important that the Swedish government was at the forefront of Swedish international relief. Siding with the Swedish government in this issue turned out to be advantages for the Swedish Save the Children Fund. The organization gained the trust of Swedish government. At this time, even if it was put on hold during the war years, the Swedish welfare state was under development. The Swedish government did implement a lot of welfare measures for the Swedes, such as pensions, benefits for the sick and handicapped, health insurances, child benefits, benefits to support single mothers, etc. But even so, the Swedish government did not reach everywhere, and this created a vacuum within which the Swedish Save the Children Fund became indispensable. During the war years, the Swedish Save the Children Fund worked with training social workers and other relief workers to prepare for post-war period. The organization supported what they called the children of the forces guarding neutrality, families where the father had been drafted, with both material and financial support. As the war progressed, this included any Swedish family in need, and together with local authorities, the organization decided which ones these were. Help were provided for so-called feeble-minded children, and the organization worked with both Swedish doctors and authorities in the prevention of children's accidents. Towards the end of the war and the years after, the organization functioned as an important advisor to the government on questions concerning where and to whom relief should be directed. It also functioned as an advisor to the Swedish Aliens Commission in deciding which children should be allowed entry into the country. During the war years, the so-called Nordic prerogative had dominated Swedish politics concerning refugees and also the distribution of relief. This meant that priority was given to ethnic Nordic neighbours, and as pointed out, the bulk of that relief was directed to Finland, but to some extent to Norway and Denmark as well. The Swedish Save the Children Fund performed their relief work in accordance with the Nordic prerogative as well, prioritizing relief to children in the Nordic countries, mainly Finland. Save the Children Fund's International Union did approach the Swedish branch on several occasions throughout the war, requesting that the Swedish Save the Children Fund should support international relief actions. The Swedish organization was, after all, a member of the International Union, and this did require participation in international relief actions. The International Union informed the Swedish organization about what the situation for children in Europe were like. But even so, the Swedish branch declined to participate in international relief on several occasions, arguing that it did not want to go against the Swedish government's outlined policies. The Swedish organization's contributions to international relief for children outside the Nordic countries was very modest during the war. Towards the end of the war, the Swedish government tried to use international relief as a means to counteract international critique, and the Swedish Save the Children Fund, but also the Swedish Red Cross, became important in attempts to, via relief work, try to create goodwill for the country. International critique towards Sweden's politics of neutrality and lack of support to relief, and after the war, the rebuilding of Europe, did, as had been predicted, surface. Sweden was accused of having taken advantage of other countries' defense efforts. This critique became particularly intense when the Swedish government declined to join the Atlantic Pact. The Allied and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, forwarded critique that Sweden ought to be able to contribute much more to the rebuilding of Europe. Sweden did not have a good reputation internationally after the war, and this needed to be changed. And as pointed out, as the war progressed, a concern of Sweden's international image did surface, but prior to this, a worry about what the Swedish-Finnish relations would be after the war also existed. The huge relief efforts that were made for Finland was not only undertaken out of humanitarianism. I have argued that this was also part of a politics of redemption. This becomes evident when the decision to transport children from Finland to Sweden was made. In 1939, the Swedish government established a committee, Central Aid to Finland, where discussions on how children from Finland could be supported took place. One activity for the children that was discussed and decided on was the transport of Finnish children to Sweden. The Swedish suggestion was received with reluctance by Finnish authorities, who did not think this action was necessary. But even so, the offer was accepted, since Finnish authorities were eager to establish good relations with Sweden, and there existed a hope that the transportation of the children could strengthen the relationship between the two countries. Finland also hoped that Sweden would change its mind and give military support. Sorry. I thought I had a picture of the Finnish children, but I didn't, so sorry about that. The chairwoman of the Swedish Save the Children Fund was a member of the government committee that was set up to deal with the relief for the children in Finland, and she gave her wholehearted support to this action. The child transports from Finland were carried out during most of the war, firstly as a government enterprise, but after the Winter War it was handed over to be carried out by NGOs and volunteers. Throughout the war, 70,000 children were brought to Sweden. At the same time as the transports of children from Finland were carried out, the Swedish Save the Children Fund declined requests forwarded by its international union to support transports of children from other countries. However, after the war, relief was provided to other countries as well, mainly carried out by the Save the Children Fund and the Swedish Red Cross, but supported by the Swedish government. Swedish international relief work was considered to provide an opportunity to redeem Sweden's dented reputation, and it also provided an opportunity to export Sweden. Now let me give you some examples of this. In France, Germany, and in the early 50s in Israel, children's homes and apprentice homes were established by the Swedish Save the Children Fund and the Swedish Red Cross. Locations were carefully chosen, and concentration of relief work to specific areas were made to ensure that relief work was made as visible as possible. One example of this was when a children's home was established in Normandy in France. A reason to pick this particular area was that there existed a great need to care for children, but also that because Swedish industry was well established in the region. To establish children's homes in the same district was considered a complement and life-giving to Swedish business that was already active in the area. The region was geographically close to Sweden, which made transports of supplies and different kind of materials, such as prefabricated Swedish houses, easy and not too costly. The children's homes were decorated with Swedish textiles, Swedish equipment, and were staffed by Swedish personnel who were trained in Swedish childcare. The establishment of the children's home created a great interest and received many prominent visitors who were interested in modern Swedish childcare. And according to Save the Children Fund, the children's home received a lot of positive attention, which of course generated much needed goodwill for Sweden. It was not only important that the homes were equipped with the best of what Swedish industry had to offer and staffed by highly qualified staff in childcare. It was also important that the children chosen to stay in the homes were the right kind of children. This became visible when a children's home for Spanish children in exile in France was going to be chosen. The task had been handed over to the Spanish government in exile, but according to the chairwoman of the Swedish Save the Children Fund, They completely failed in this task, and in a letter to a co-worker she wrote, "The Spanish government in exile had chosen the children for Moulin Rouge very badly. One was apparently completely imbecile, two others backward, and whatever else they were. We have to see, maybe it will work out. The Spanish government in exile had been given clear instructions on what kind of children would be best able to take advantage of the special resources offered at Moulin Rouge. It was important that the show homes were perfect, and this included that the homes were filled with suitable children, so that Sweden also could show off its expertise in childcare. Another place where Swedish relief work was going to be directed and thereby given an opportunity to yet again show off Swedish welfare was Germany. In Germany, did not only opportunities to export Swedish welfare service, it also became it became possible to export a Swedish model of society. As you know, an important task in Germany after the war was not only to demilitarize Germany, it was also important to denazify or reorientate the German people. This to turn them into citizens that could live and function in democratic societies. The children and youth should be exposed to a democratic and systematic upbringing. This was a task the Swedish Save the Children Fund commenced upon to help out in the reorientation of German children and youth, teaching them how to live by democratic values. Children's homes and apprentice homes were set up, and the interior was carefully planned to make them as homely as possible. Also here, equipped with the best of what Swedish industry had to offer. The children were encouraged to play, and youth were encouraged to participate in international discussions. They should be taught to voice their opinion and listen to others. Even if it was considered important to teach German children to live in a democratic society, the Swedish staff at some of the homes expressed an admiration for the results of the German upbringing. Children that had been brought up in Hitlerjugend or Deutsche Bundmädel were described as well-behaved, whilst children placed in the homes that came from the mass camps in Europe were described as spoilt and misbehaved. But after having spent time in these homes and having been exposed to the Swedish democratic lifestyle, also these children changed, according to the Swedish staff in the homes. The establishment of the apprentice homes and children's homes was considered to be a success. Pompous inaugurations were held both in France and Germany, and prominent people from UN, ministers of the different countries, members of press and radio were all invited to celebrate the Swedish contributions. And as you can see in these pictures, these homes were equipped with all the best that Sweden could offer, and there was also a very pompous inauguration in the corner there. These pictures are taken from a home called Swedenheim, which also says something, I think. And this picture is taken from one of the apprentice homes, and I think this one is from a place called Hochland Lager or something like that. And in these homes, they actually sometimes mixed boys and girls. I couldn't find a picture of that, but and it's also interesting that the boys are helping out in the kitchen. That was also a part of the sort of Swedish modern child raising. And I don't know if you can see, but that's in the corner there, where the young man is doing some carpentry. You can actually see on the box that it says Swedish and something, and I can't read the rest, I'm afraid. My German is not very good. But it was always very clear that they always wanted to show off that it was Swedish. Everything was Swedish. The idea that the running of the different homes was eventually going to be, the idea was that the running of the different homes was eventually going to be handed over to the Germans. However, this did not always work out as wished for. In a report written by a Swedish Save the Children Fund representative after touring Germany in 1954, this becomes evident. The running of some of the homes had been neglected, which according to the Swedish Save the Children Fund representative was unfortunate since it created a negative image of Sweden, and in a report she wrote, "Annoyingly, it is the homes in Munich that receive most visitors, since most tourists pass through this town, as well as on study tours when the homes are visited and displayed as an example of a Swedish gift." The Swedish Save the Children Fund had very modestly made contributions to Jewish children both during and after the war. As late as 1947, the organization declined a request from the Jewish World Congress to support transports of Jewish children from east to west, arguing that this could be considered as a political action. In the early 50s, the organization did, however, carry out extensive relief work in Israel in conjunction with the Swedish government. The Swedish village Kvar Ashmin was established. 75 prefabricated houses were transported from Sweden and constructed on site. This, together with a fully equipped nursery, yet again with all the best Swedish industry had to offer. Also here, pompous inaugurations were held. At this time, there existed a pride among Swedish politicians of the emerging Swedish welfare state. Amongst them, it was generally considered that the Swedish democratic model of society could work as a model for other countries. The Swedish Save the Children Fund assisted the Swedish government in its effort to export these visions, Swedish welfare and the Swedish model of society. However, by doing this, it had to, on several occasions, compromise its utilitarian founding principle to help as many children in as many places as possible. The organization repeatedly declined to participate in relief activities that was initiated by this international union, even though the union emphasized that help from the Swedish organization was needed in several places in Europe, both during and after the war. After the war, the chairwoman of the Swedish Save the Children Fund, Margit Levinson, became one of the International Union's Deputy Secretary Generals. Unfortunately, her work there was characterized by constant conflicts with members of the board, but also with other international organizations such as the Red Cross and UNICEF. The Swedish Save the Children Fund had no desire to cooperate or undertake relief actions where it was not clear that the Swedish organization carried out the activities. And I have argued that to create goodwill for Sweden and export Swedish visions became so important that the organization many times let that overshadow humanitarian goals. Thank you for listening.
Very much. That's absolutely the most fascinating thing I've heard in a long time. Can you tell, I mean, I think probably, even though we've all been watching Scandinavian television, what about the Danes and what about the Norwegians? Why was there, did Sweden do things for them? Why Finns and not anybody else? What was the reason to have concentrated on Finland?
I think it's because Finland was not occupied. It was easier, Norway and Denmark very quickly became occupied by the Nazis, and it was more difficult to provide relief. And also in 1939, I think there was such a fear of having the Soviet Union as a next door neighbor that all the help was provided to Finland at that time, not really realizing that the threat from Germany. At the time,
But after Norway was taken over by the Nazis, they didn't try to take children out of the way to shift them away from it.
Some children came from Norway, but it was more complicated because Norway was under German rule. It wasn't that easy. Finland was never occupied, even though there was a war. They were never occupied, so they sort of decided over their own people. But in Norway, that you had to go via the Nazi rule, and that became more complicated.
And did they, by any chance, prioritize any Jewish children from Finland? I mean, in a sense, maybe it wasn't such a problem there.
I think there were very, very few Jewish children in Finland. I would say it was almost non-existent.
There were around 5,000 from Denmark.
Right, yes.
I mean, that's, you know, there's a book just being published about, which I'm sure you're probably aware of, about the what happened in Denmark and how the Danish government got, you know, virtually all of the Jewish families, including children, across mostly to Sweden. And that was, you know, if the Swedish Save the Children Fund wasn't involved with that, they should be out, you know, it's an outrage. It really is, because if they weren't involved in that, when in fact the Germans were complicit in doing it, Werner Best, who was the kind of Gauleiter for Germany, in fact tipped off the Danish government that the Jews were going to be deported, so there was an active complicitness there. And so there was absolutely no reason why the Swedish Save the Children Fund couldn't have been involved directly in the move of pretty much all Danish Jews across. Is there any records of that?
I haven't seen any records of the Swedish Save the Children Fund making
So
any, and I've looked at a lot of material.
Silence presumes indifference.
Yes, I would say so, yes.
Yeah. They stand condemned.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. When everybody was doing good, they stood by. And the other thing about Finland, of course, is you've got to remember that there were 2 wars in Finland.
Yes, of course.
And that in the second so-called continuation war, in fact, the Finns were supplied with weapons by the Germans. So, and there were, in fact, German and Finnish soldiers fighting side by side.
Yes, of course.
Including actually Finnish Jewish soldiers. And there's even accounts that Jewish services were held on the German lines, which German soldiers attended out of a sense of support for the Finnish soldiers. It's a very interesting picture. I'm really surprised because there would have been an influx of probably, you know, several thousand Jewish children into Sweden from Denmark in the latter part of the war. It's about 1944.
Yeah.
And I mean,
I haven't seen any record of that.
You'd have thought that would have been such an obvious thing for the Save the Children Fund to be involved in.
I think the Swedish Save the Children Fund did not want to go against Swedish politics of neutrality at all, and it was very complicated because.
But the government was going against it.
Sorry.
But it was virtual Swedish government policy to accept Jews. They weren't sent back.
No, they weren't sent back, but there weren't that many allowed into the country, and that changed towards the end of the war. But Sweden was one of the countries.
I disagree with you.
Okay.
The Swedish border was open to Denmark. No, I'm not aware of any Danish Jew that was turned back from Sweden.
Okay.
I'm not aware of it.
I'm sure you're right.
There was total, you know, I suppose I should make a confession, I'm half Danish through marriage. You know.
Okay.
So my wife's Danish, and I took a considerable interest in that and how it happened. It's a very interesting story, but I went to Sweden most. Some went elsewhere, most went to Sweden.
I haven't seen any record of the Swedish Save the Children Fund helping out in that, but I'm sure you're right.
I suppose, can I have a second question also? Because Sweden, and I put a second question out, I'm a former social worker, and Sweden stands slightly condemned for having adopted what is loosely described as a Nazi policy right up until the 50s, which is enforced sterilisation, which I think happened up until the mid-50s in Sweden, where you know, people who are mentally, you know, mentally incapacitated, usually low intelligence. It was actually almost a virtually formalised policy of sterilisation in Sweden. Stopped, I think, 56.
Yes.
Now, I just wondered, did the Save the Children Fund take any view on that?
Not as far as I know. No, I don't think they were involved in that at all.
Yes.
But that has been, the sterilization has been debated.
Yeah.
Whether that actually was not just people who had just that is still as bad as anything, but that it wasn't as extensive as people have claimed. But I'm not sure. I'm not familiar. I don't know.
So there's debate about that, but
right.
The debate is not about the presence, but the extent.
Right. Okay. Well, I can't answer any questions about that, I'm afraid.
But
I don't know.
You're not aware that they save because presumably if you're thinking about saving children, then that will be
sorry.
Almost.
I haven't seen anything in this material about that, I'm afraid, at all.
No,
sorry, no.
They didn't take any view on it.
Well, I guess not. I couldn't tell.
Yeah.
I mentioned this politics of redemption, which is an aspect I haven't actually considered about the Swedish Save the Children Fund and how difficult it must be to maintain neutrality. I've always just been struck personally by the fact that Sweden had all these business arrangements with the Germans, but this sort of sounds like if they were to curtail these, that would be, and this is sort of put them at risk of invasion. But at the same time, I was also struck, as Mita was, by the emphasis on Finland and helping Finland and providing relief to Finland. While Norway was under German occupation. I have a vague notion that Norway and Sweden don't get on so well since the separation in 1903 or 1905 or something. I just wonder, given that they had business arrangements with the Germans, would that not make it a bit easier for them to extend their policy into occupied countries such as Norway, since they are, I suppose, de facto more on the side of the Germans than against them by having these business arrangements? And what extent that might have hampered or poisoned their efforts to deal with the Norwegian people is that the fact that they were business partners of the Germans, perhaps the reason why they weren't able to achieve such an outreach into places like Norway.
I'm not sure actually. I don't think it had to. I think it was more. Sweden was absolutely. The Swedish government was absolutely adamant of keeping Sweden out of the war, no matter what. Whether that had something to do with the history with Sweden and Norway and I'm trying to find the English words here now. The parting of the two countries historically, I couldn't tell. But
so Finland, of course, wasn't occupied, so perhaps it's easier for them to intervene in that country without encountering any sort of politics that are going to put them on one side or the other. But of course, Norway is obviously embroiled in the conflict, so perhaps a little bit more difficult from.
Yes, I think Sweden was very careful in not go into conflict with Germany at all. And it's a politics that have been heavily criticised, which I think is fair enough.
That position, of course, is good policy too.
But it's
the Germans in that particular part of the world.
I think you have to remember also that when you're in the middle of something, it's difficult to see. We see a lot of things now, 60, 70 years later, but at the time, difficult decisions were made. But Sweden has been accused of enforced a very coward politics during this time, and then some people say that that defended the politics say that what would have happened then? Sweden would have been occupied too, and in that case we would not have been able to do anything at all.
So Sweden finished the war with intact cities and intact industry because of this policy. So they're in a very good position, I suppose, to lend relief to the rest of the world at the same time. So.
Yeah, it was a very selfish politics, definitely.
Could it also have been because an occupied country, in the sense where Germany was occupying Norway, they would not have wanted it to appear as if the people in that country that they were occupying and therefore in charge of needed any relief, and so therefore they weren't. They didn't want to accept it because accepting relief would almost seem like they couldn't take care of what they now occupied. Because in a sense, occupation isn't necessarily in war anymore. They basically surrendered, given up, and now they're for intents and purposes, they're German. So, whereas Finland was never occupied, and so their government was obviously like, yes, we need help, send all the help we can, we're trying to fight this, trying not to give in. The other countries had already given in, and so therefore, any acceptance of relief would have almost been acceptance of inability to take care of their own.
Yeah, that is possible. I really don't know that much about the politics around Norway to be able to give you a good answer to that. But I think that sounds
There's a massive difference between Norway and Denmark in terms of World War. In Norway, everywhere there was some kind of resistance or opposition to German occupation, you'll find a war memorial. They're all over the place in Norway. In Denmark, you hardly find anything. One of my relatives, my wife's relatives, he was a young kid, and he was shot by the Germans because he was running away, and the soldier shot him, not killed him, but wounded him. And the Germans profusely apologized for it. He was 16 years old, and a German officer came, to my wife's relatives and was incredibly apologetic and said, this should never have happened. He was just a kid, and the soldier was totally out, shooting at a kid running away. It shouldn't have happened. And for the most part, the occupation in Denmark was quite, not problematic at all. It was like the Channel Islands in some respects. But in Norway, it was quite different. There was a lot of significant opposition, and there was a lot of fighting. And you also had a split in the government, because the Quisling government in Norway, in fact, Quisling right up till the end was supporting Hitler, and you had, in fact, Norwegians fighting the Waffen-SS. And so there's a big split in Norway, and Denmark was less so. It was a more relatively mild occupation in comparison. It was quite different.
George?
Thanks. Thank you, that was really interesting. I have two sort of questions which I guess are related. One is about the Swedish Save the Children Fund, and I guess the Red Cross and any other groups that were working in Germany after the end of hostilities. Were they working in particular zones, and what was the relationship like with obviously, because obviously Germany was split into the American, the French, British zones and the Russian zone, and I wondered what the relationship was like then as a former power that hadn't helped out the Allies and yet was now trying to get in on the relief action. What is their reaction? Are they just happy to have any help, or is there a problem? And the second question is then about how successful is this policy then of trying to create goodwill for Sweden through humanitarian relief work? What are the issues, and how is it? How does it go? Yes.
But I think Sweden's relationship to the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration was very complicated, and UNRWA was not at all very sort of welcoming, which is quite understandable, I think, because Sweden refused to have. Sweden wanted to have sort of everything to be bilateral, with different countries, there was a great need in Sweden to sort of redeem, to work on this, on the image of Sweden, and because of that, Sweden needed to show that it was Sweden that was doing it and not by any other organization. So the relationship to UNRWA was not very good, and it was quite complicated. I have read documents where it said that when Sweden went out to offer help in different countries, UNRWA ignored this sometimes, but it was important, for Sweden to get in there, which Sweden did to a certain extent. But to answer your question about concentration, I think most of the relief actions in Germany were in Bavaria. Is that what you say? Yeah. American zone, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that would make the as far as I know. But that is actually a whole new research field which I'm trying to get into.
Okay.
So I can't answer more than that. But I think Bavaria, most parts in Bavaria.
Okay, sorry.
You mentioned these kind of how many local organizations there were, and I was just wondering who's making these decisions about, for the organization, is it mostly the head honchos, or do the local groups, do they have any say in what the policies are that the charity is taking?
Oh, you mean the local branches in Sweden? Yes, I think there were some sort of national outlines, but I think mostly which is something that the Swedish organization didn't follow very well, was that it was actually supposed to work in accordance with the international Save the Children Fund's outlines. And this was rejected several times. And I think what you can question there is whether the Swedish organization actually was sort of entitled to work under the Save the Children Fund flag, because it didn't, that became very complicated. And, many years after the war, I mean, there were still problems. The Swedish Save the Children Fund had a very sort of, I'm not sure what to call it, but they just wouldn't subordinate to the international union. It was a very sort of self-goodness sort of way of performing relief. We know best. We weren't in the war, but we know best. It was a very patronizing way of doing it. So,
Yeah.
I was interested to see some of those figures who played such influential roles in the development of the movement. And what I started to wonder was they mostly appear to be women, which might, I suppose, correspond with the larger history of Save the Children's movements during this period. But I wondered about perhaps the socio-dynamics of participation and whether or not this was an enormously popular cause throughout Sweden, to which everybody in the country could expect to know somebody who was participating. And to that extent, were these leading figures ending up at the top of the organisation because they were very talented, or was it more perhaps a class dynamic, that they were quite wealthy and this was the cause to which they could devote the most money, and therefore they occupied a very influential role within it? So what were the dynamics of class, and how did these people rise to the top of this organisation?
I think the people at the top were, part of the Swedish sort of intellectuals, political elite. Sweden is a small country, and people in government and NGOs, they sort of go in and out of government, and then they end up working for an NGO. They have a leading position in an NGO, and then go back to government. And they're all, sort of married to each other, and brothers and cousins, and so they go in and out of the organisation. But it was mainly the upper. I wouldn't say just the upper class after the war, but definitely the intellectual and political elite in Sweden that was running this.
So did the movement was able to extend towards sort of the lower reaches of the social strata as well, and perhaps in local areas they were, housewives who saw this as a worthy cause that people could contribute their energy to?
Yes, I would imagine so. Yes, especially in the early years of the Save the Children Fund, because it was sort of you had the time to do this. I think it became, during the war and after the war, it became more professionalized. But you must remember that in Sweden, women got a right to vote in 1921. So obviously there was, in 1919 or 1920, when the organization was established, this was an arena where women could get out of their homes. They could actually feel that they were doing something. And a lot of women were active in the peace movement or political, even if they couldn't vote. So yes, definitely.
Well, one of my former students was chief exec of a Swedish-based organisation which had a significant involvement by the Swedish royal family,
Right.
Queen of Sweden and so on. And he said it gave him enormous leverage because the Swedish royal family were pretty well connected, and he said they were basically ignorant of the kind of work he was doing, but they were connected enough to make to give him a lot of leverage through that. Right. And I just wondered, to what extent did the sort of Swedish royal family get engaged with this and through the war or any other way? As you said, intellectual and political elite, you haven't said social elite.
No.
Was royalty involved in this?
Royalty was involved to a lesser extent in the Swedish Save the Children Fund, but in the Red Cross, very much so, because the chairman of the Swedish Red Cross was Prince Carl, and the vice chairman was Folke Bernadotte, who was a member of the royal family. I think the Princess Ingeborg, 1945, she gave her sort of protection to Swedish Save the Children Fund, but the Swedish Red Cross was much more connected to the royal family.
Yeah. The Red Cross generally, you could arguably say, had ended up after World War II, ended up quite prestigious.
Yes,
carried, it had been accepted both sides of the conflict, together with the Salvation Army.
So I suppose maybe one question is, I mean, when at a couple of points, it occurred to me that, branding a sort of, the Swedish kind of culture and lifestyle when you're giving aid, this isn't exactly something that's been confined to Sweden. I mean, I think this characterizes most American aid, that these bags of rice are brought to you by the United States government, etc. I mean, in a sense, they're doing what governments do and countries do to maximize their own advantage. So I mean, in a way, I don't think it's entirely fair to beat up on Sweden for doing stuff that everybody else does as well. I mean, and even dare I say it, things like sterilization. I think you're probably sterilizing people in the US of A.
In Canada as well, actually.
Yeah, a lot longer. Let's not go overboard on.
I don't think America got rid of it until the 70s, maybe even early 80s.
Yeah.
Sweden's actually quite nice getting rid of it. That's how we mind.
Going back to the organisation, we're talking about the great and the good who form the, if you like, the central presidium, the committee, the board. And I'm assuming that the local branches were there to support the work of the centre.
Yes.
And had little, if any, contribution towards the decisions that were made, except that the decisions were made creating an organisation they didn't like, they would stop working for it.
Yeah, of course.
But they didn't stop working
No.
for it during this period because
No.
the number of branches grew. So there must have been that sort of local grassroots support.
Yes, absolutely.
Certainly for what they perceived.
Sure, yes,
Sweden
absolutely.
said the children were doing.
Yes,
So,
definitely.
yeah, but the decisions were being made by the great and the good.
Yes, yes.
Very much so. Who as you say, have all these connections into an active government. So it's hardly surprising that they marched in step,
No,
to a considerate step with the government.
no, it's true, it's true. I know that they had sort of, annual meetings where they gathered all the local branches and the heads of the local branches, but whether they actually had, I think, some questions were put forward on these meetings. So let's all go together and make a decision in this, which actually the decision was probably already made, But yeah,
In government's terms, was it ever different?
Yeah.
I was just going to ask about the kind of internal publicity then, because given that they weren't out particularly contributing to the war effort other than through, in terms of international relief during the war, obviously they were focusing very heavily afterwards. During the war they were focusing on Finland particularly. How are they communicating that to members, also to local branches and supporters? Was there any questioning within the journals, the newsletters of Save the Children Fund, of this policy of supporting the neutrality position?
not that I have seen. No, I think it was all, when Finland was attacked, it was like the whole of Sweden woke up. And I don't think they really needed to, I'm sure there must have been some communication on newsletters and things like that. I haven't looked at that. But, the press, the radio, it was all over Sweden. Sweden had connections, Sweden had families in Finland, there was a lot of family ties, etc. It was just this whole wave all over Sweden. And I think there was just never a discussion or a question. Sweden should support Finland in absolute every way we could.
At the time, I know now that Swedish is in effect the second language of Finland.
Yeah.
Was that so then?
Oh, absolutely. There are Swedish-speaking parts in Finland, but language is definitely completely different.
I know the Finnish language is based in North Scandinavia, but it comes from Hungarian. But Finland, is the second language in Finland is often Swedish, isn't it?
Well, it used to be. I'm not sure what it's like now. The whole sort of Swedish in Finland is a bit sensitive.
Yeah.
It's been, there's been a lot of debates about whether they should be Swedish speaking or not.
Yeah.
But there's certainly, on the east coast of Finland, there are some Swedish-speaking.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So it's actually the plight of Finland which drives the expansion of Save the Children in Sweden.
Yes, I think you could say that, yes.
I mean, that, you're quite one which everyone's concerned about.
Exactly.
And there is this organisation which is one means of addressing those concerns.
That's right, yes.
And it's hardly surprising that they grow membership and grow local branches.
One thing you haven't really talked about is actually the experiences of the children themselves. I know you've done research on that already.
Yes.
When you were sort of talking about the homes in France and being a kind of model and promoting kind of Swedish, thoughts on childcare and proper everything. How did that work with Finland? I mean, did the Swedes actually feel that they had a lot to teach Finland as well, or was it more an equal relationship? I mean, they're looking after Finnish children, but they weren't trying to prove a Swedish point about it. I mean, or was it? What was going on in the actual provision of childcare?
I think the whole transportation of children from Finland to Sweden, there was a way of trying to build bridges of trust between the two countries. And I don't think, it's always difficult to say, but I mean, we know now that most of the war actually took place at the borders to Russia. So even though if Helsinki was bombed a few times and there was certainly war movement in Finland, very little was actually, most of the war was taking place at a sort of front line, which made the transports, so a lot of the Finnish children themselves have said that this was completely unnecessary. And this was a politics. Sweden wanted to do a grand action to cover up the fact that we didn't help support Finland militarily. And I think this was something that was just initiated by a few people, and it was just went on. And when this whole big machinery was going on, all these children came, it was too late to say stop. And a lot of these children, they were actually moved back and forth between Sweden and Finland several times. And, if you move a child of 2 and he comes to Sweden and he stays there for 2 years, he forgets his parents, his language, and this same child was moved back to Finland. And then there was actions of war again, so he was moved back to Sweden, perhaps to another family. So this was it was very traumatic for a lot of the children. But of course, there's 70,000 children, there are 70,000 stories. So we do. For some of the children, it was okay. But for a lot of the children, it was, they became very ruthless. They forgot the language, they forgot the parents, and they, became attached to their foster parents. And
I was going to ask, so there are these children who are today, I suppose, approaching their 70s and so on. Are there any social problems as a result of this movement or this enforced movement during the disruption?
There's been a lot of social problems, I think. There has been a lot of, the children have felt very ruthless. There has been a lot of, apparently alcoholism is to a higher degree amongst the Finnish war children. Depressions and things like that. There actually hasn't been, there have been sort of smaller studies made of the Finnish war children. But
were they able to settle in Sweden if they so wished after the war? They became adults.
I think some of them actually, if they were moved back to Finland, they actually came back to Sweden as adults. But it was certainly complicated because in some of the cases with the Finnish children, they actually ended up in the Swedish courts because the Finnish government went out and said that all the Finnish children should be brought back to Finland. That was sort of a government, an order from the government. But obviously a lot of Swedish parents, foster parents, they try to adopt the Finnish children. And sometimes the Finnish children's parents wanted the child back. Sometimes they thought, we better leave our child in Sweden. They have forgotten it's best for the child. But the Finnish government wanted all the children back because this was obviously a loss for Finland.
But also saving the children, of course, has created all sorts of problems in the decades to come.
And I think that, there was also, you could go into race biology. General Mannerheim, who was the president of Finland, the war president of Finland, he said that he wanted to send the Finnish children to Sweden to save the Finnish race. But this actually became a loss for Finland because 9,000 children never went back. So, there are so many different aspects.
I recognised at the time that I'm not quite sure how advanced developmental psychology was at this period, that when they decided to ship them back and forth, this was likely to cause disruptive problems in the ensuing decades that would somewhat negate the point of saving children to become healthy, productive citizens. But of course, if they feel group risk and if they don't have a good head on their shoulders from this experience, did they recognise perhaps the impact that these movements would have on the children?
I think when Anna Freud's and Dorothy Burlingham's study from the nursery here in Great Britain, that was actually acknowledged in Swedish newspapers in 1944. They started to talk about the problems with parent-child separations. But it never really caught on. It was discussed, and it was discussed in relation to the movement of the Finnish war children as well, but it sort of never really latched on in Sweden until the 80s, actually, which is quite interesting. So, the feeling was that we send the children to Sweden, they get food, they get clothes, and that's fine then. We don't really sort of worry about the psychological issues.
The same thing happened. There was a view at the beginning of the war that there'll be a huge obliteration of cities, and so kids were sent out to the countryside from the UK, and some indeed people sent their kids abroad to Canada and so came back, and that. So it's a lot of that sort of went on.
Oh, it's very, the last couple of decades, the Finnish war children are now retired, and they have time to write their books, their biographies, their memoirs, and there is certainly, there's been a lot of very moving stories that has been told.
Thank you very much. That was incredible.
Thank you.
Shall we?